Hello, brothers. There wasn't enough brothers that were available for today's session, so I thought I would just go ahead and record it so that we don't get too far behind in the sessions. I want to be able to review all the assignments for you for the Proverbs passage that you've been assigned, and so I wanted to go ahead and press forward. So, with that, today we're going to cover, uh, Lord willing, assignment 3.16. Whoops, sorry, that's the wrong. Where are we at? Here we go. Uh, this session 3.9, we're going to cover assignment 3.16, which is the setting and structure of the Proverbs passage for your assigned Proverbs passage. And so, with that, let's jump right in. Where we're at in the process again, poetic analysis is the step that we are doing. For Proverbs, we did do the first three steps. So that was in the assignment 3.15 that we covered in the last session a couple of weeks ago. And there we looked at the book of Proverbs as a whole. Even though Proverbs is a collection of proverbs similar to Psalms. Psalm is a collection of independent poems. That's why we don't study the whole book of Psalms when we look at when we are preaching from a particular psalm. But for Proverbs, even though it is a collection of Proverbs from chapters 10 to 20 to 31, there is still a common author, primarily Solomon. There is a theme and a focus, and we see that in the first few verses of Proverbs. There is an overarching flow. Now, chapters 10 through 29 are the shorter aphorisms, and so we don't see the context there because they're usually just one or two verses. But chapters 1 through 9 have a clear flow context. They are larger poems, they're extended poems, one full chapter each, and they do have a link. They're connected together, and they really set the foundation for the chapters 10 and on. And so really we do want to look at the book of Proverbs as a whole, even for studying a particular passage in Proverbs. Now you've been assigned a passage from Proverbs from those first 9 chapters. I think actually chapters 2 through 9, because so those are extended poems, similar to a psalm, but different in that they are not independent poems. They are linked together in the book of Proverbs. And so there will be a lot of common steps, or the steps that we take in studying Proverbs will be similar to what we did for Psalms. There'll be poetry, biblical poetry, but there are a few hermeneutic principles we have to remember as we covered in class when it comes to wisdom literature. And we'll get to that as we move further in the process. But today in this session, I would like to focus our attention on the poetic analysis for your Proverbs poem. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the setting and structure of the poem. Okay. That is the background of the poem and then what its structure looks like. And so to do that, I want to use an example from Proverbs 1. But before we do that, we need to first read and observe our passage, the particular poem, but not just the we read and observe here. We're going to not just read and observe the specific passage, but the whole chapter in which your poem is contained. Because when your assigned poem from Proverbs will be, 6 or 7 or 8 verses from one of these chapters, chapters 2 through 9. But you need to understand how that portion, those verses you've been assigned, fit in the entire poem of the chapter. All right. So we're going to do in the setting and structure of the poem, we need to look at the chapter as a whole, the chapter in which your passage was assigned. So, for example, if you were assigned Proverbs 3, verses 19 to 26, you're going to preach verses 19 to 26. But for this assignment, you're going to look at all of chapter 3, all of Proverbs 3, because it's one complete poem connected. So I just gave you like certain sections of a poem, so you didn't have to preach the whole chapter. Though at times I have preached entire chapters from Proverbs. but that's more of a challenge and need more time. So for the 30-minute message, I just have assigned to you a shorter section from one of these extended poems in the first 9 chapters. And so this assignment, you'll be focusing on the chapter as a whole. The following assignments, you'll just focus on your passage. All right. But this assignment, you need to do it for the whole chapter. Okay. So with that, let's dive right in. We're going to use Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 to 19. That's going to be the passage that we'll be looking at. And that means we're looking at the poem, the poem from the entire chapter, chapter 1. All right. So this first step in setting analysis, in fact, let me just pull up the assignment, if I can find it. Assignment 316, the example here. All right, let me do this again. Assignment 316, there it is. Okay, now in this assignment, let me just give you the overview of it, and then we'll look at an example. This is assignment 316, setting and structure analysis for your assigned Proverbs passage. And there's 3 steps for this particular assignment. The first step is to read and observe the poem several times and make at least 15 general observations. And then, as I noted here, note for a passage from Proverbs 1 to 9, read the entire chapter. Let me bold that. The entire chapter, since each poem from this section is a chapter length. So as I just was explaining. So don't just do your verses. Do your observation, setting, structure for the whole chapter. Then, so the first step, read and observe. Read through the whole chapter several times. Make at least 15 observations. And then identify the setting of the poem. What is the background? And really, you've already done this because you did background context for the book. And it's essentially the same thing. So just summarize that here. Then identify the type and structure of the poem. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. And then I provide for you in the assignment an example from Proverbs 1, 10 through 19. We're going to go through that together right now. But that'll be on the assignment just as a point of reference for you. Okay. So first we're going to read and observe. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Then we're going to identify the setting. Again, that's remember who wrote the poem, when was it written, are there places mentioned, people mentioned in this specific poem, the chapter, cultural context, has any situation prompted the poem, what's the occasion? And again, some of these are going to be answered just from your previous assignment for the background context. Following that, you'll identify the type of poem you're studying, and that really, honestly, again, this is simplified for Proverbs. Essentially, they're all wisdom poems, right? Proverbs is a book of wisdom. And so in this case, the poem's going to be a wisdom poem. And then the structure, and that is, okay, what is the stanza or structure, the outline for the poem? For, again, the whole chapter, can you identify the stanzas? So let's do that for Proverbs chapter 1. And again, remember, the structure of the poem reminds us that in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, they are extended poems. There are stanzas. Each stanza represents a unit of thought that is linked together to form an overall theme for that poem. So chapters 1 through 9, each chapter has a particular theme. All of them link together to fulfill the purpose of the book as a whole, but each stanza, or each chapter, excuse me, has a particular theme that is linked to that overall flow of the book. And then within each chapter, you have stanzas that represent the units of thought that develop that theme for that chapter. All right, so the structure is just simply identifying those stanzas. Same thing we did for the Psalms. Same exact thing, where the psalm was a particular theme, and it was broken up into stanzas, and you identify each of those stanzas and then how those relate to each other and to the theme of the poem. Now, how do we identify the structure of the poem? How do we identify the stanzas? Well, remember, Bible translation identifies the stanzas. And so we have each translation presents, here's an example from Psalm 3, presents the stanzas. Here, I can just pull up. let's see here. Sorry for the delay. If we look at Psalm 3, for example, notice here there's a space between verses 2 and 3. You see that here? And so that's the translator's way of identifying the different stanzas. So this is, and then so verses 1 and 2 form a stanza. Then we look at between verses 6 and 7 also forms a stanza. And then as we look at 7 and 8. So this is the Legacy Standard Bible. If you'll notice, essentially, they have a stanza, verses 1 and 2, or one stanza, verses 3 and 4, 3 through 6, and then 7 through 8. But if we go to the English Standard Version, the ESV, notice that they have it a little bit different. They have between verses 1 and 2, like the LSB, but then they split up verses 3 to 6. Notice there's a stanza, a separation of space between verse 4 and 5. So they have one stanza, verses 1 and 2, second stanza, verses 3 and 4, third stanza, verses 5 and 6, and then the fourth stanza is verse 7 and then verse 8. So they've broken it up quite extensively. If we look at the New King James, we'll see they broke up verses 1 and 2, verses 3 and 4 as a second stanza, verses 5 and 6, then verses 7 and 8. Okay, so notice there is a difference. Sometimes the translations agree, and then we say praise God, because if they agree, that means that's likely what the stanzas are. Not all the time, but that's a good indicator. But sometimes the translations differ. And again, the translation's just their interpretation, their opinion. The stanzas they identify are not inspired. So as we look at the different translations, we may see that variation. Now, the translation is not the only way to identify the structure or the stanzas in the poem. It's one way. It can be a helpful way, especially if the translations generally agree. That gives you a good guide. But there are some other features, some other aspects to look for in identifying the stanzas. So not only do we look at the Bible translation, but then also consider the refrain. Remember, that's sort of the repeated, like a chorus at the end of each stanza. So look for a refrain. That could indicate stanza break. A change in speaker. Psalm 2 is an example of that. Can indicate the different stanzas. Or a change in pronouns. Sometimes you'll see that and going from I to he, or from Yahweh, focus on God, to me, to I. So you may keep an eye on that. Sometimes you'll see stanza that will be predominantly or mainly focused on one particular person, and then maybe the psalmist, and then it may shift to the next stanza focusing on God, or something like that. A change in the subject or theme. See that in Psalm 1, where the first half of the psalm is focused on the righteous, the second half on the wicked. A change in tone. Psalm 13 is an example. It's a lament. So we see the lament in verses 1 to 4. And then in verse 5, there's a shift to a tone of encouragement, of praise. Sometimes that word Selah can mark out a standard. And that's what one of the translations did for Psalm 3. But Selah is normally not a good indicator of the different stanzas. Sometimes it is, not always. So be careful there. And then, of course, the inclusio, where this is a repeated statement. It's normally going to be almost exactly the same, but it'll be at the beginning and the end of the stanza. Sometimes we see it at the beginning and end of the poem. A few cases we see it inside of the poem, and an inclusio indicates that that is a particular stanza. Okay? Then example there from Psalm 67. So we went through this in class. You can go to the syllabus and look at these examples in more detail. I'm just sort of giving you, by way of reminder, a review of this. Okay? So with that, a couple more things I forgot. Changing grammar sometimes can indicate, sometimes one stanza may have focusing on indicative verbs, making statements, and another stanza focusing on commands. So sometimes you'll have that. or sometimes it'll be present tense verbs and then future tense. So keep that in mind. And finally, exclamations. Sometimes poems are broken up by direct address, oh Lord, or in Proverbs, often my son, or oh my son, or sons, as often can be possibly a break in the stanzas. So keep an eye out for that when you're doing Proverbs. Okay. With that, let's now do the first two steps here for the Proverbs 1. And again, these steps are included in your assignment 316. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and read Proverbs 1, the whole chapter, and then we're going to do some observations. And normally, if we were all meeting together, I would have you do this, but since it's just me, I'll just give you a few just to demonstrate by way of example what's going on here. All right, and what to observe. Okay. Now, as you make observations, let me remind you, brothers, the observations are not just summarizing verses. Okay, it's just you noticing things. Sometimes things that don't make sense. You may have a question, so write the question out. Other times there may be something you see repeated that sticks out to you. Sometimes you may notice something interesting that may remind you of another passage or another part of the poem. Sometimes just you can make hypotheses, or, verse 2, he seems to be talking about this. But general observations is not just going through each verse and summarizing it. That's not what we're looking for here. Now, sometimes a verse may strike you and you may present sort of your idea of what you think the author's saying. That's fine. But observations are a variety of things, essentially anything that gets your attention, seems interesting to you, doesn't seem clear to you, or is something that you notice. Okay? So as I read Proverbs 1, that's what we'll be looking for, is just these general observations. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to, here we go. Let's see. Am I identifying the, hopefully you can see that. Maybe sorry, let me try this again. Having a little bit of trouble with the computer here. Okay, here we go. All right. Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. Wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you, because I called and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. Then I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and they did not choose the fear of the Lord. They will not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their way and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil. All right, well, that's the whole chapter. It's all of chapter 1. And uh, I did highlight some things here, and I'll explain that in a minute. But first, let's look at some make some observations. And again, these are just observations that I observed. So first, notice here. Let me just unhighlight it. I think that'll. Okay, notice chapter 1. As we saw before, the first 7 verses are really the introduction to the book, to the Proverbs. And we see here the author. So I noticed that the author is clearly identified here. One thing that came to my mind as I considered the author was 1 Kings, verse 4. Chapter 4, verse 32 mentions that Proverbs wrote 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs. So that was a thought that came to my mind as I was reading the passage. Verse 7 here, and I'm just picking a few things. Verse 7, notice, seems to be a foundational verse. After the introduction where Solomon presents the reasons, the purpose for the Proverbs, then verse 7, he seems to give sort of this blanket statement. So this was something that I had noticed, picked up on as well. Solomon here, another observation I made, notice several times he repeats, my son, my son, my son. All right, so he's speaking to his sons in particular. Notice in the first few verses, though, it does describe the general audience here for the Proverbs, that it's to give prudence to the naive and to the youth knowledge. A wise man will hear, a man of understanding. So notice he mentions a few groups of individuals that these Proverbs are directed to. And even more specifically, we can see him mentioning his son as he moves into the poem. So that's something that I picked up on. Verse 20 personifies wisdom as a woman. You notice that? Notice wisdom shouts in the street. That's personification. She utters her sayings. And then it's as if wisdom is speaking. Now, wisdom is a thing, not a person. But here, Solomon uses the personification of wisdom as having the traits of a person, of a woman in particular. This kind of adds to the poetic nature of what he's saying, what he's communicating here. Some have compared wisdom to Jesus because earlier in Genesis it talks about wisdom being present in creation. Jesus being described in John 1 as the Word. But you got to be careful there. When I read into the text, I think here and notice the wisdom here is a woman. So I think he is describing specifically wisdom as a personification here. So that's another thing that popped out to me. I saw a repetition here in verses 23 to 25, or proof, counsel, reproof. So those were a few words words I think he also mentioned. Counsel here in verse 30, reproof in verse 30. So we see that described as well, repeated anyway. Another thing that I noticed being repeated was dread and calamity. Dread verse, let me see, maybe I'll use another color for that. Dread, calamity, storm, whirlwind, distress, anguish. Verse 26, calamity, dread. So we see real emphasis, particularly in those verses, on calamity, distress, just a bad situation coming upon them. Okay. So those are some things I saw repeated. Verse 20, a question came to my mind when it says, um, is my question was, is verse 20 the answer to the how to avoid the wicked that he mentions here in verses 8 through 19? Notice there the focus seems to be, don't go down the path of the wicked, don't do that. And then is verse 20 sort of the solution? That was a question that came to my mind. Another was verses 20, 21, right? He describes wisdom, he personifies it as a woman. I just want to add a question, why did he do that? And then why does this woman cry out in the streets at the gates? What's the significance of that? So that was another observation. Now, again, in the assignment, you're going to make at least 15 observations from the text. I just gave you a few by way of example. So you'll have these. I put them here. It's in your notes, different observations I had just by way of an example. All right. Again, notice there's questions here that I asked. I made a few observations about wisdom. I noticed some repeated words. I noticed something came to my mind from another passage. So these are things to include as you're considering the observation step. So you're going to want to take at least, if you're going to read the translation or read the passage several times, the whole chapter, and then this step will probably take you, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how fast you read, and read different translations in English. I'd recommend that as well, but try to read it several times and then do that. Okay. Now, the next step for poetic analysis, after you read and make observations of the poem, the next step is to identify the structure and the setting of the poem. So we'll do that. The setting of the poem, and again, in this case, if you're doing the setting for a psalm, the psalm is independent. So it'll have its own setting, its own background, its own historical context, the places and people mentioned. Now for Proverbs, each chapter here is part of the whole book of Proverbs. And so really the setting essentially matches the setting for the book. In other words, the author, unless you're toward the end, that there may be an author other than Solomon, but at least in these first 9 chapters, the author is Solomon. He is speaking there. Here specifically, we'll note that, but you'll want to recognize there'll be some things that are going to be common to the background for the whole book, the setting for the whole book. Okay. But as we consider that here for Proverbs 1, what I'll do is so the text is to the right here. Maybe I'll make it a little smaller to see if you can see a little bit more of it. Okay. And then here on the left, we'll look at so the title, and again, the title is the superscription, and Proverbs does not have a superscription. You may see a title in the Proverbs, but that is from the translator. What I mean here by title is the one given by the author, and that's in the Psalms. We won't see that in Proverbs, so you just would mention no superscription here in Proverbs. All right, so that's easy. Now the author, again, we already know from Proverbs 1:1. The author is Solomon, and then you can just cut and paste, copy from what you put for the background context, what we know about Solomon, what we know about the author. Now the recipients. Now again, we have the general recipients given in the chapter, and they're mentioned here since this is the first chapter. So we have the recipients, right? Verse 4. Proverbs 1:4 indicates it's the naive, the youth. Verse 5, wise man, man of understanding. Okay, these are some of the recipients, and then of course we see in verses 8, 10, and 15, my son. All right. So in this particular chapter, we do see the general audience for the whole book of Proverbs, but then also as he begins his poem, he zeroes in, he's focused on his sons. Again, verse 8, my son, verse 10, my son, and then verse 15. Okay. Now, the other thing for the setting of the poem, you do this for the Psalms, is that when it's written. Well, if it's written in the days of Solomon, likely um, in his early life, because later, right, he went astray from the many wives that he had, and they led him into idol worship and things like that. So this is likely, before that took place. We don't know exactly when, but we know Solomon reigned from around 970 to I think 930 BC, if I remember correctly, something like that. So probably, 960 BC, somewhere in there, maybe he wrote these. And geography. So we look for, okay, look over here, any places mentioned. Well, Sheol is mentioned in verse 12. So I might note that. Verse 12, Sheol is mentioned. Of course, Israel is mentioned in the first verse. So verse 1, I mentioned Israel. So we want to indicate, what do we know about these places? Sheol, right? That's a place of the dead. Some believe, in some cases, it's refers to Hades, and sometimes it does. Other times it just means the dead, place of the dead. Israel, of course, we know is a nation chosen by God. So here mentions the king of Israel. There'll be other places mentioned later in the book: Sheol, Abaddon, Judah. Those are just a few of the places, but not much here. So you just note a little bit of what do you know about these locations. All right. Yes, the streets mentioned, the square, the city gates. Those are a little bit more general. You can note those if you want, but here we're looking more specific locations. But yeah, you could indicate, the street, verse 21, the gates of the city. All right. People mentioned. All right. So what people are mentioned in this particular poem? Again, we don't have any specific names, but we do see mentioned again in what is it? Verse 4, uh, the naive, the youth, the wise man of understanding, his son, my son. So those would be people that you could indicate or mention. What do we know about them? So what is the naive? So verse 4, the naive. What do we know about the naive, right? Someone um, uh, that is morally brainless, essentially has not yet chosen path of the fool or the wise. Someone, a simpleton. Okay. In fact, he mentions that. Where is it? Yeah, verse 22. Oh, naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? All right, so we even have there simple-minded. Of course, fools are mentioned in verse 22 and also verse 7. Fools, right? And those are ones who reject God. They reject wisdom. All right, so you're going to just note that. Verse 5, the wise are mentioned, man of understanding. You'll talk about that. Verse 8, 10, 15, my son. Okay, so Solomon's son. So just note those. And then finally, the last is the occasion, or what prompted the writing. We've already discussed that this poem is part of the broader Proverbs book, which again is mentioned. The reasons that he wrote the Proverbs are mentioned in verses 2 to 6. You can just repeat those here. Okay. So that's it, pretty straightforward. This won't take you very long because, again, much of it you'll gather from the setting for the whole book. But there'll be a few features that you just want to focus on the chapter, like what's mentioned, people mentioned, places mentioned, and even sometimes the recipients may be more specific in that chapter. Okay? All right. Now, the type and the structure. And again, type, we would look for, when I say type of poem, you have the Psalms, right? You have praise, lament, thanksgiving, royal psalms, also wisdom psalms. Now, in Proverbs, they're essentially all wisdom poems. Okay, they're all meant to provide instruction in wisdom. So this will be easy to answer this question for your Proverbs passage. Now, for your Psalms passage, it could be one of a variety. The Psalms of Ascent is another category. So in your Psalms passage, you're going to be looking there. The psalm could be many uh, possible types, but the passage from Proverbs is going to be a wisdom poem. Then you're going to want to structure. Now, remember what I said for the structure, you're looking at the stanzas. First, I'm going to consider, look at the translations and see if there's some overlap there. Notice the New American Standard and the ESV have some agreement, as does the Holman Christian Bible. We do see some similarity in the beginning for New King James, NIV, but then it breaks up things a little differently after that. So, but we do see some commonality, so that's helpful. I would see now as you look at to the right here, I've highlighted verses 1 to 7 because those look like the introduction, and all and go together as introducing the book. Then we get to verse 8 and 9, where he's introducing or making a declaration about the instruction. And then I would break up the poem this way, and let me show you why. So we have the translations give their input, but then I want to consider, are there any structural markers in the poem? And notice we do have a structural marker, don't we? My son, verse 8. My son, verse 10. My son, verse 15. So those might, I think, indicate perhaps at least a stanza break at verse 8, 10, and 15. Okay, it seems to be another statement. We consider a change in tone or speaker. We notice here something in this poem. Notice in verse 20, there's a change in the speaker. It goes from Solomon here, my son, hear your father's instruction. My son, if sinners entice you, my son, do not walk away. Notice verse 20, now it is wisdom speaking. Wisdom lifts her voice in the squares, and then we have wisdom. And then verse 28, they will call on me, I will answer. They will seek me, but they will not find me. It seems like no longer is it direct address, right? Here in verse 20, how long, O naive ones, will you? So how long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? Turn to my reproof. Again, that's speaking to them. I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. I call to you, and you refused. Eunuch. So notice that. But then, notice in verses 28 and following, they will call on me. They will seek me. They would not accept. So it seems to move from the direct address, second person, to third person. So I would note that, verse 20 to 27, second person, direct address. And then verses 30 or 28, to 33 is third person. Use of third person. Okay. They, right? Them. So these are, again, just indicators. They aren't always telling us, okay, oh, for sure, this is a stanza, but they're an indicator of that. So I think taken all together, I would break up, if you look at the right here, into these stanzas. 1 to 7 is the introduction. 8 to 9 is sort of focusing now on the poem from chapter 1 and just making this general statement about the importance of father's instruction. Verse 10, he directs them, sons, gives a direction. If sinners entice you, do not consent. So he's talking about these enticements. And then verse 15 through 19, he addresses my son again, and he exhorts him, don't go their direction. Then in verse 20, there's this shift to wisdom speaking, and she's speaking directly, second person, to the naive. And then verse 28, wisdom still speaking, but there's a shift into the third person. So I would take these as the stanzas here, verses 1 to 7. In fact, I think I already. And you could break up the introduction into two stanzas if you want. Solomon's purpose for the book in verses 1 to 4, and then his declaration about wise men and fools in verses 5 to 7. Then, and this is what you're going to do in your assignment, you're going to break down the stanzas for the whole chapter. All right, what's the structure of the whole poem? So here I had verses 8 and 9, 10 and 14, because again, that's my son. Verse 15, 19, my son. And then verse 20, wisdom speaks, second person, and then wisdom. So here I summarize each of the stanzas. All right, that's what this is. And that's what you're going to do for your assignment. Summarize each of the stanzas. All right, let me just take you back to the assignment. All right, so I have the observations here and the example for you. Then I have the setting, the example from Proverbs 1 for you, and then the type in the wisdom poem, and then I walk through how I identify the structure, the different stanzas, then I summarize each stanza. Okay? That's exactly what you're going to do for your assigned psalm. Read the whole chapter. Notice again the whole chapter of your assigned passage. So again, I had verses 10 to 19 as the assigned passage for me in this example, and so I read through all of chapter 1 and did the observations for the whole chapter. Again, let me highlight that. Okay? And then what you will do following this is the setting. I put space for that. And again, much of this you're just going to copy essentially from the background setting. And then identify the type and structure for your passage. Again, hold the whole chapter. All right. So okay. So that's it. And then give a summary. Summarize each stanza like I did for chapter 1 in your own words. We're going to do more work, more effort down the road, but just this is kind of an initial summary of the passage. So this is kind of your first focusing attention on your specific text. And then the next step or the next assignment is the parallelism, where we'll go through the parallelism of that your particular passage. Okay, so that's assignment 316. If you have any questions about it, let me know. I have graded almost all the assignments, so I am almost caught up, but there's just a handful left I'm going to finish grading. So there's still a number of you that are a little bit behind on your assignments, so please stay with those, work on them, just try to do, a portion at a time. Don't let that stop you from coming to Module 4 in June, but really do your best to get these things done so you'll be able to preach from your assigned passage and feedback and all those things. All right, so Lord willing, next week, hopefully we'll be brothers be able to gather, and planning to do our time together next week, and we'll cover, Lord willing, parallelism, our assignment on parallelism for your assigned Proverbs passage. All right. So I just want to wish you guys blessings for your weekend and your time of fellowship and preaching and teaching. All right. Thank you, brothers. I hope this was helpful.